It all began when my family and I moved into our new suburban home. The neighborhood had an eerie calmness to it, with old trees casting long, sinister shadows on the narrow streets. Our new house sat right next to the one that would soon become the epicenter of my worst nightmares. Our neighbors were unusual from the get-go. Their house, a decrepit Victorian relic, seemed to be plucked from a different era. Paint peeled from the walls, and the windows, always drawn closed, felt like the eyes of an ancient, malevolent spirit watching our every move. But it wasn't just the house that sent shivers down my spine. Our neighbor, Mr. Hargrove, was an enigma. He was tall, thin, and had sunken eyes that gleamed with an eerie, yellowish light. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He always wore a dark suit, even in the sweltering summer heat, and a bowler hat that obscured his features further. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a hoarse whisper that sent chills through my bones. My curiosity got the best of me, and one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood into darkness, I decided to investigate. I crept up to Mr. Hargrove's house and peeked through a crack in the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. The dimly lit living room was adorned with an array of bizarre and disturbing artifacts. Shelves were lined with old dolls, their lifeless eyes staring blankly into the void. In the center of the room, an ornate ancient mirror stood, framed with strange symbols and exuding an unsettling aura. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. As I watched, Mr. Hargrove entered the room, holding a small ornate box. He placed it on a table and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of withered, yellowed teeth. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what I was witnessing. This man was a collector of human teeth. I stumbled back in horror, my breath catching in my throat. What kind of person collected such macabre trophies? I knew I had to find out more, but I also knew I had to be careful. Mr. Hargrove was not someone to be trifled with. Over the next few weeks, I began to spy on Mr. Hargrove whenever I could. I watched as he conducted strange, late-night rituals in his backyard, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. He seemed to communicate with the shadows themselves, and the eerie, whispering wind always accompanied his incantations. One night, as I hid in the bushes, I saw him beckon to the shadows, and they responded, swirling and coalescing into a monstrous form that sent a shiver down my spine. It had elongated limbs, razor-sharp claws, and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly malevolence. Mr. Hargrove spoke to it in hushed tones, and it obeyed, disappearing into the night. The fear that had been gnawing at me grew with each passing day. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and my grades began to plummet. My family noticed the change in me, but attributed it to the stress of our recent move. They had no idea of the horrors that lurked next door. One fateful night, I couldn't resist the urge to investigate further. I sneaked into Mr. Hargrove's backyard, heart pounding in my chest. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver glow over the scene. I approached the mirror, my reflection distorted and twisted by its malevolent aura. As I stared into the mirror, I felt a sudden, irresistible urge to touch it. My fingers brushed against the cold glass, and in an instant, I was pulled into the mirror's depths. I found myself in a nightmarish realm of endless darkness, surrounded by the tormented souls of those who had fallen victim to Mr. Hargrove's sinister rituals. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted in agony, and they reached out to me, their bony fingers grasping for escape. I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by their anguished wails. I knew then that I was trapped, condemned to join their ranks for all eternity. But just as hope seemed lost, a voice whispered in my ear. It was Mr. Hargrove, his yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. He offered me a choice, a way out of this nightmarish prison. All I had to do was bring him more teeth, more souls to add to his collection. In that moment, I made a desperate pact with the devil himself. I agreed to do his bidding, to lure unsuspecting victims into his grasp in exchange for my freedom. With a malevolent grin, Mr. Hargrove released me from the mirror, and I stumbled back into the real world. From that day forward, I became his unwilling accomplice, leading innocent souls to their doom. Each tooth I brought him weighed on my conscience, a constant reminder of the horrors I had witnessed and the darkness that had consumed me. And so, dear reader, as I pen down my horrifying tale, I implore you to beware of the shadows that lurk next door, for you never know what horrors may await you in the house of the creepy neighbor. Growing up, my parents often warned me about the importance of being neighborly. They said it was essential to maintain good relations with those living around us. Little did they know that the man next door would redefine my understanding of the term neighborly in the most disturbing way possible. Our small suburban neighborhood seemed tranquil enough, but there was always something off about Mr. Everett, the man who lived in the house to the right of ours. He was a middle-aged man, tall and lanky, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow that made him look disheveled. His unkempt appearance was the least of our concerns. I first noticed his peculiar behavior when I was about 13 years old. It was a hot summer's day, and I was playing catch with my younger brother Tim in the backyard. I glanced over at Mr. Everett's house and saw him standing at his bedroom window, staring directly at us. His gaze was unwavering, and his eyes were hidden behind thick glasses that reflected the sunlight, making them appear as cold, lifeless orbs. It sent a shiver down my spine. Over the next few weeks, his voyeuristic tendencies became increasingly apparent. He would always be at the window, watching us play, work in the garden, or even just sit on the porch. It was unnerving, to say the least, and my parents couldn't help but feel uncomfortable too. We decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, assuming he was just a lonely man with too much time on his hands. But the feeling of unease never left us. One evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, I went outside to retrieve a forgotten ball from our front yard. In the dim light, I noticed Mr. Everett standing by his mailbox, staring at me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes burned with an intensity I couldn't comprehend. I hurried back inside, heart pounding, and told my parents about the eerie encounter. My parents confronted Mr. Everett the next day, expressing their concerns about his constant surveillance of our family. He apologized, blaming his curiosity on his lack of social interaction. He assured us he would try to be more mindful. Reluctantly, we accepted his apology, hoping things would change. For a brief time, it seemed as though Mr. Everett had turned a new leaf. He no longer lingered at his window, and we began to relax. However, the eerie feeling that he was still watching us persisted. It wasn't long before our suspicions were confirmed. One evening, my parents went out for dinner, leaving Tim and me home alone. As the night grew darker, I went to the kitchen to make a snack. That's when I heard it, a faint, eerie humming coming from the backyard. I peered through the window and froze in terror. Mr. Everett was standing in the darkness, right by our fence, holding a small, flickering candle. He was humming a haunting tune, his eyes locked onto our house. I rushed to grab Tim and called the police while keeping a vigilant eye on Mr. Everett from the window. When the police arrived, they found him still in our backyard, humming his eerie tune. He was arrested for trespassing and taken away, but the ordeal was far from over. In the following weeks, we discovered the true extent of Mr. Everett's obsession. The police found a shrine to our family in his basement, a disturbing collection of photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal items he had stolen over the years. It was a chilling reminder that his obsession with us had been anything but harmless. We moved away shortly after the incident, eager to put the nightmare behind us. But even in our new home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that I saw Mr. Everett's shadowy figure lurking outside our window. I became paranoid, constantly checking the locks on our doors and windows, fearing he might find us once again. Years passed, and the memories of our creepy neighbor haunted my dreams. I could never truly escape the feeling that his watchful eyes were still upon me, waiting for the right moment to return. It was a horror that went beyond the physical, seeping into the very core of my existence. To this day, I wonder what drove Mr. Everett to become the embodiment of our worst nightmares. Was he simply a lonely man with a twisted sense of attachment? Or did he hide darker secrets that we may never uncover? One thing is for sure, I'll never look at the term neighborly the same way again. The experience left me scarred, forever vigilant, and with a chilling reminder that the horrors of reality can be far more disturbing than any ghost story. I'll never forget the eerie feeling that settled in the pit of my stomach the day the Forrester family moved into the house next door. It was a charming suburban neighborhood, a place where everyone knew everyone else's name. But when the Forrester family arrived, they brought with them an unsettling presence that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It all started innocently enough. My family had lived in that cozy little house for as long as I could remember. My parents, my little sister Emily, and I had enjoyed a peaceful existence on Willow Street. But when the Forresters moved into the house to our right, things took a sinister turn. Mr. Forrester was a middle-aged man with an unassuming appearance. He had salt and pepper hair, wore outdated glasses, and dressed in a perpetually wrinkled suit. He introduced himself as a historian, claiming to have an insatiable curiosity about the past. But there was something off about him, something that sent shivers down my spine. The first odd occurrence happened one evening when I was playing catch with my dad in our front yard. I noticed Mr. Forrester standing by his window, staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His unblinking eyes followed our every move, and a chilling smile never left his face. It was as if he was studying us, dissecting our every action. That was just the beginning. As weeks turned into months, Mr. Forrester's strange behavior escalated. Emily, who was only 7 at the time, would often complain about the eerie feeling of being watched while playing in our backyard. At night, we could hear odd, muffled sounds coming from the Forresters' house, whispers, strange chants, and the occasional eerie laughter. One evening, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard faint scratching sounds coming from the wall that separated our bedrooms. It was as if someone was using long, bony fingers to scrape the wallpaper. My heart raced, and I summoned the courage to investigate. I tiptoed to the wall, pressing my ear against it, and what I heard made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural voice muttering unintelligible words, punctuated by sinister laughter. I retreated to my bed, terrified and unsure of what to do. My parents were becoming increasingly disturbed by Mr. Forrester's behavior as well. They had tried to engage him in polite conversation, but he always managed to steer it toward bizarre topics, like ancient rituals and forbidden knowledge. He would even show up unannounced at our doorstep, bearing gifts of peculiar books and strange artifacts. One rainy evening, as the thunder rumbled and rain poured down relentlessly, the power went out in our neighborhood. The darkness was oppressive, but we lit candles to provide some light. We huddled together in the living room, trying to comfort Emily, who was trembling with fear. It was then that we heard it, a loud banging on our front door. My father, brave as always, cautiously approached the door and opened it. There, standing drenched in the rain, was Mr. Forrester. He was holding an antique lantern, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on his face. "I thought you might need some light," he said with a sinister grin. My mother thanked him, but I could see the unease in her eyes. As Mr. Forrester left, he whispered something that sent shivers down our spines. "Remember, when the dark comes, we all find our true selves." The power eventually returned, and the storm subsided, but the encounter left us all deeply disturbed. We decided it was time to involve the authorities. When the police arrived and questioned Mr. Forrester, he seemed strangely calm and cooperative. They found no evidence of wrongdoing and left, advising us to keep our distance from him. With no other options, we tried to go on with our lives as best as we could. But the fear and unease never truly left us. The scratching sounds in the walls continued, the strange rituals grew louder, and Emily's nightmares became more frequent. One fateful night, as I lay in bed listening to the unsettling whispers, I heard a loud crash coming from the Forrester's house. I rushed to my window and peered outside, my heart pounding. Flames were devouring the Forrester's home, and thick smoke billowed into the night sky. The fire department arrived quickly, but it was too late. Mr. Forrester's house was reduced to ashes. As the firefighters sifted through the debris, they made a gruesome discovery: a hidden underground chamber filled with ancient relics, strange symbols, and a collection of journals detailing Mr. Forrester's obsession with dark rituals. In the end, the truth about our creepy neighbor was more horrifying than we could have ever imagined. Mr. Forrester had been conducting sinister experiments, dabbling in the occult, and invoking ancient forces that should never have been tampered with. His obsession with the past had driven him to madness, and his house had become a portal to unimaginable horrors. As we watched the firefighters extinguish the last of the flames, a chilling wind seemed to blow through Willow Street, carrying with it a sense of relief and dread. The nightmare was over, but the scars it left on our family would linger for a lifetime. We moved away from that once charming neighborhood, leaving behind the horrors of the house next door and hoping to never encounter such a neighbor again. I was just an ordinary guy, living an ordinary life in an ordinary neighborhood. That was until the day the new neighbors moved in next door, and everything changed. What started as a simple change of residence turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. It was a chilly autumn evening when the moving van pulled up in front of the old house next to mine. I watched from my window, curiosity getting the best of me. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair emerged from the van. He looked ordinary enough, but there was something about him that sent a shiver down my spine. Over the next few days, I couldn't help but notice odd things about my new neighbor. He seemed to only come out at night, and when he did, he would just stand in his yard, staring at the moon for hours on end. It was as if he had a strange connection with the night, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease whenever I saw him. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I finally had a chance to speak to him. He introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood and seemed polite enough, but his eyes had a distant, haunted look that sent chills down my spine. I tried to make small talk, asking about his move and the neighborhood, but he was evasive, answering my questions with vague replies. As weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with Mr. Blackwood. The neighborhood seemed quieter, as if the life had been sucked out of it. People started to keep their distance from him, and children would whisper tales of strange occurrences at his house. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate further. I crept out of my house and into the backyard, keeping a close eye on Mr. Blackwood's property. What I saw that night still haunts me to this day. His backyard was filled with candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the ground. In the center of it all was Mr. Blackwood, dressed in a dark robe, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched in horror. It was as if he was performing some kind of sinister ritual. I quickly retreated back into my house, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The next day, I decided to do some research on Mr. Blackwood. I couldn't find much about him online, but I did discover that he had a history of strange behavior in his previous neighborhood. There were reports of missing pets and bizarre occurrences that had driven his former neighbors to move away. I felt a growing sense of dread as I realized that I might be living next to a true nightmare. I decided to confide in my best friend Mark about what I had seen. He was skeptical at first, but the fear in my eyes convinced him to investigate with me. That night, we waited until Mr. Blackwood ventured into his backyard again. Armed with flashlights, we approached cautiously, our hearts pounding in our chests. As we got closer, we could hear him muttering strange incantations under his breath. The air grew cold, and a sense of malevolence hung in the air. Mark and I exchanged a nervous glance but pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the night, freezing us in our tracks. It was coming from inside Mr. Blackwood's house. Without thinking, we rushed toward the front door, desperate to help whoever was in danger. But when we pushed it open, What we found inside was beyond anything we could have imagined. The walls of Mr. Blackwood's home were adorned with bizarre symbols, and the rooms were filled with jars containing strange, pulsating objects that looked otherworldly. In the center of it all was Mr. Blackwood, his eyes black as coal, standing over a terrified young woman who was bound to a table. We couldn't comprehend what we were seeing. The young woman's eyes were filled with terror, and she begged us for help. Without hesitation, we rushed to her side, doing our best to free her from her restraints. Mr. Blackwood lunged at us, his strength unnatural, but we managed to overpower him and escape with the young woman. We called the police, and Mr. Blackwood was arrested, his house sealed off as a crime scene. The young woman, still in shock, told us that she had been lured into his home and subjected to unspeakable horrors. In the days that followed, the truth about Mr. Blackwood began to emerge. He had been involved in a sinister cult that practiced dark rituals, and his intentions toward the neighborhood were far from ordinary. It turned out that the strange occurrences we had witnessed were just the tip of the iceberg. As I sit here now, recounting this terrifying ordeal, I can't help but wonder how close we came to becoming victims ourselves. The memory of Mr. Blackwood and his nightmarish rituals will haunt me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder that evil can lurk just next door, hidden in the shadows of an ordinary neighborhood.